I'm doing something slightly unusual for me here, in that I'm recording the introduction to week 2 before I've seen very much of the discussion on week 1. But I want to try and get ahead of myself in the first couple of weeks of term. So in week 2, I want to look at games and learning and how we build learning games. Mostly I want to look at the games part of it. And I have a couple of things there as readings for this. The John Seeley Brown Douglas Thomas paper talks about it lays a lot of foundation and explanation about literary games and dispositional stances in games, and it talks a lot about World of Warcraft. They even use a screenshot that I've used myself in a conference paper. They talk about how in these massive multiplayer online games, the game world provides players with a certain degree of agency. There are things you can do. And because the game is multiplayer, what happens is that it is the combined use and exercise by all the players of their agency that produces the emergent nature of the world. It is not necessarily entirely predictable what will happen, and in fact in the history of Warcraft and online communities that have evolved around it, some very interesting things have emerged through collective player action. So really what they're looking at here is the ways in which the rules of the game create a sort of simple, systematic model of a world within which players can act. They have agency. Human agency is an important part, for example, of historical analysis. And how this facilitates people changing their understanding of the way the world works and develops their understanding, and how people learn about each other and build communities. Green Across the Board, the Green Across the Board article is a discussion. It's two things. One, it's a discussion of how to use board games, and it refers to a number of board games, as a means for communication about environmental science and climate change. And so it takes 4 games, and it looks at how those can be used for building community, socialization, how they can be used for sustainability, education. And it goes back even as far as ancient Egypt. There's an argument that the ancient Egyptian game Senet was in fact a game which taught about, let me try and get this one right now, was one which taught about planting seeds. Yeah. It talks about the use of board games for these variety of different ways and means of communicating and getting people to think about stuff and learn about stuff by doing. So it's an active constructivist pedagogy. It's also useful from our point of view, and we'll come back to it, in that it talks about the methodology of doing qualitative research, how they recruited people, the games they used, how they interviewed and recorded the research protocol, how they did the research, and then how they coded the transcripts, and then what results they found. So how they did it we will look at later on when we look at qualitative research methods. We'll come back to this. They then they talk about how what they learned. These are not very surprising learns. Board games can be innovative and simplified portrayals of complex environmental issues, and how useful those are, and how people reacted. And they have quotes from the research interviews there that show what they learned about people's reactions on those themes and what they found. So the discussion and the results are interesting and useful. So finally, the third article is one of my own. It was delivered at the All Ireland Society for Higher Education conference more than a decade ago. I've done a slightly similar version, shorter one, at a conference in Spain since then. And it talks about my process in how I first used wargame design as an assessment method in a second-year undergraduate course, actually in history. So it explains the logic and the reasoning for using historical simulations as an alternative to traditional assessments, as a way to get people to understand the processes of history and make decisions about what was important. What did you have to build into the game? What were the questions that you needed to play out in the game and needed to model in the game? So it gives an insight into the way I started off. So it's an easy entry point for this. It does not cover a great deal of what I've done since then about using political military crisis role-playing simulations in international organizations courses, which I've done for many years, and some of the game design stuff that I've done in the master's programs. So there's a whole pile of extra stuff there, but it does provide a basic introduction, and it will help you to understand my thinking on what we're doing and why we're doing it. So have a read of those. In the discussion prompt, I have explained a little bit about the 3 readings, and I've said, what I've said is you read these and then pick a topic, and based on those 3 readings, make an argument, lay out a plan, come up with a concept, an elevator pitch, as you were, not more than 400 words, less if you can do it, for how you would argue for designing some game-based learning on a topic that's of interest to you, which picks up the ideas from these 3 readings and folds it into a short, brisk statement. It won't be perfect. Everybody's will be different. This is a starter. This is to get people thinking about the field of game design as a learning activity. And I've set a deadline on that. I think I've put it on the to-do to have it done by about Friday, so we have time to respond and see what topics emerge that are common, and build from there. That will then allow us to build up to the question of what is research, and how we know research and how we approach research. So we will then have, in the first week, we've looked at a little bit about learning. In the second week, this week, a little bit about games and learning and how they fit together. And then we will move on to looking at, okay, how do we do research to build a learning game on a particular topic? And then we'll get into the meat of research and into the game design part in the second half of the course, with always an eye towards that. So that's the plan.